I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by an HBHA alum, graduate of the class of 2002, and an accomplished author. Welcome to HBHA Lore, Danny Magariel. Thrilled to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, Danny. So as I just mentioned a second ago when I introduced you, you are an author. You have published two books, I believe. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what are the names of the two books that you have written?
The first one was One of the Boys. It came out in 2017, and the second one is Walk the Darkness Down. It came out in 2023.
Okay. So my first question I have for you is really just the process of how you came to be a writer. So as I mentioned, you graduated in 2002. And then 15 years later, you say 2017, you published your first book, One of the Boys, which I have read both of your books, and I found them both to be excellent. I'd highly recommend them to anyone listening to this episode. But can you just talk us through the process of kind of those intervening 15 years between when you graduated high school? I'm sure there is a lot of work, a lot of studying and writing, and a huge process that went involved between when you graduated and how you ended up publishing your first book.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for reading the books. I appreciate that. I will say that the two of the happiest experiences I have as an author is returning to Kansas City for both books and having sort of the HBHA community come out for those events. Both of them have been really meaningful for me. And one of the reasons I was so motivated to and overjoyed to come on the podcast. I think hindsight's 2020. I'm not sure anybody would have identified me as authorial material when I was at HBHA, but I loved writing since middle school, and I was writing poetry on my own for a very long time. I think it was just like that and basketball. They're both preferred means of sort of self-expression. One would just wore me out on the court, and I was allowed to sort of do sort of the physical thing, and then the emotional, sort of spiritual, and sort of artistic work of writing. I was always drawn to. I can still remember. Miss Boswell reading to us. I could still remember Miss Kagan talking about sort of the different themes of the essential themes of the literary arts, the conflicts, and so I left in 2002. I went to the University of Kansas for a year. And then I went to the University of Hawaii for a semester. HBHA, another HBHA alum, Andrew Marks. He wasn't happy where he was at Western Washington, and I wanted to get out of Kansas. And so we both decided that Hawaii was the place we should go. And ironically, while we were there, he was writing short stories, and I was doing tons of yoga, I guess. And then somehow the roles reversed over the course of years, because I know he really got into sort of a alternative health, and I became a novelist. I think I took a year off school and I worked in a bookstore because I wasn't sure what I was doing, and time was flying by, and I wanted to move to New York at that point. And And I got into Columbia University and I moved to New York. And it was there where I started to take my writing a lot more seriously. I think there's something that happens in New York. It's a magical place. I think it's really hard for people, I think, to imagine uh, the possibility of fulfilling one's dreams in sort of isolated places. I think that can be really hard. But when you go to a place like New York, and you see people doing the thing that you've always dreamed of doing, um, you become inspired. You start to believe in yourself a little bit more. And so there was this coffee shop next to Columbia University on 111th in Amsterdam. It was called the Hungarian Pastry Shop, and I would just go there for do my homework and read and study. And it turned out that there were several pretty famous and established writers who were working there at the time. They would just show up, get their coffee, and pull out their laptops. Two of which were Nathan Englander and Rivka Galchen, who
Oh,
became,
Nathan Englander,
yeah,
I've taught one of his books for the relief of
yeah,
unreal urges. I teach that
yeah.
senior English
So
class. Great collection of Jewish themed short stories.
it's an extraordinary collection of stories by an incredible American writer and an incredible Jewish American writer. It's really something. And his other collection, what we talk about Anne Frank, is also an extraordinary collection. And so he became kind of a mentor for me. And I remember going over to his house and playing writer poker, and people like Holson Whitehead would show up.
Oh my goodness!
I
I,
know, I know, I know.
oh wow! For people who don't know Colson Whitehead, he's an extremely accomplished author. Has won
Two-time Pulitzer winner.
prizes for the
Yeah.
Underground Railroad in a book called The Nickel Boys, which is probably my favorite book I've read in the last 10 years. Honestly, a book I absolutely adore. Sorry to interrupt. I just got so excited about
I know.
you hanging out with Nathan Englander and Colson Whitehead. This is an English teacher's dream to hear. Continue.
Yeah. So I mean, these were writers who were probably in where I'm at now, you know, at that point. They'd published one, they were working on a second book, they published two, they were working on a third book, and they were just in this community and they were friends. And so I just sort of I followed that journey. I kept writing. I think right before I graduated from Columbia, the last semester, uh, something kind of incredible happened. I became absolutely terrified of going into the workforce and not really knowing what I wanted to do and did not have a goal in mind. And I said to myself, well, what do you actually want to do? If you could do anything. And I was like, oh, I want to write fiction. And so I said, well, you better start, like start for real. And so that's when so basically that was 2008. And I've written every day for the last 17 years.
Wow, that's
Yeah, and yeah, and I went to grad school. I was at Syracuse where I worked with George Saunders, who became a very dear mentor of mine. I know.
I also love George Saunders.
Yeah.
This
So
is
George,
a real English teacher's podcast right here, Danny. I
so
appreciate
George Saunders is a legend, and the most generous and kind soul I've ever met, and the most generous and kind author. He really is an artist saint. And I was really privileged. He really believed in one of the boys as a project, and really kind of like folded me under his wing, and helped me think through the project while I was at grad school. And it took me 4 years after I graduated from Syracuse to finish and publish one of the boys.
So along those lines, that's kind of my next question is just kind of, the idea of writing a book to me and really probably to anyone listening seems like a really daunting task. Just like, where do you start? How do you begin? Like, what's that process like? So you kind of guided us through the process of, your path to knowing you wanted to write. But can you tell us a little bit more about, especially with that first book, you hadn't written a book before. What was that process like in terms of, do you start just by outlining ideas? Did you start by bouncing ideas off of your mentor? What was kind of the process you went through from coming up with the initial idea to the publication of one of the boys?
I think you probably used the right adjective, daunting. That's what it is, even for writers who are going through the process. It is a daunting process to try to figure out how to do that. And it gets more and more difficult, to be honest with you, in terms because you know how to write one in one kind of way, and then you're interested in writing a second in a different kind of way. And I'm on a third book that I should have finished in the next year, and it's a completely different project with a different voice and a different narrative structure, and it requires so much more from me than the other books did, and at least it requires parts of me that I haven't developed, and I think part of writing a book is a years long process. I call it a tightrope marathon, where it's just one step after the next, or you'll fall off, but you have to stay on that tightrope for 4 or 5 years. I think for me, I always felt fortunate that I knew what I wanted my first book to be about. Um, Lots of first novels are based off personal experience. James Baldwin said about Go Tell It on the Mountain that he had to write that book before he wrote anything else. And I felt very much that way about One of the Boys. It was a story that was very close to me and my identity and my heart and my family. And so I felt fortunate to have a story to tell. I had fortunate to have a first story to tell. And so process of writing a book, especially a first book, is also the process of learning how to write. And so I had the material and I had a loose narrative arc that I believed in, even though that changed and changed and changed, and characters were deleted, characters were added. But I was able to explore voice. I was able to think about how would this story be told in third person and write a whole draft. Think about how the story would be told in first person. Think about what this would be in a more loquacious, sort of like Stark style. Think about what it would be in a pared down minimal style. And then as um, whether to tell it linearly, whether to start at the end, and so all of these questions I was able to sort of work through all of these influences that I felt that some of the early drafts were really derivative of. Um, they were just a way for me to learn how to sort of develop the toolbox to be sort of a literary author. And then eventually I sort of just I tapped into it. What's funny is that the submission pages that I sent into Syracuse were the same pages that I was working on that final year at Columbia. And they were really kind of very much like a natural voice for me that I was trying to fight. I was trying to find other sorts of styles that I was interested in. And I remember talking to George Saunders when I was at Syracuse, and I turned in like a really messy draft of a novel about domestic terrorism in Oklahoma City. And it was this sprawling book. And he's like, it's good, but what about the story about the two brothers that I read 2 years ago? He just said, I would recommend you focus on that, which is his way of saying the thing you
Go the
turned
other
in
way.
is trash.
Yeah.
And so I was like, okay, I will. And I mean, that's the thing about like I thought I had what I had in my hand was gold. I'd spent a year and a half writing a book that was 120,000 words, which is to give reference is like 4 times the size of One of the Boys, twice as long as Walk the Darkness Down. I thought I had like an American masterpiece in my hands, and he was, and I haven't looked at it since.
Wow.
And so I dug back in, and I realized that this is sort of a natural style, but I returned to it having sort of like having grown as an artist and grown as a writer, and so I was able to handle the material. I was able to figure out, oh, what the power of this is it's not just its brevity, it's its velocity. This story is told at a breathless pace. And so, how can I continue this story and just move as quickly, just escalate as quickly as possible? And so that became sort of the governing principle for the style for the boys.
Wow. And that's really what you said about having to kind of abandon that huge manuscript you're working on for a different book. That's really, I feel like, just an incredible thing to have to navigate for a person's ego and just, something that you've worked on the other book that, you didn't publish, to just be able to say, I poured all I could into this. And you know what? It's not what I want it to be. I'm going to go in this other direction. Like, I feel like for writers, especially, but really for anyone, that's kind of an incredibly challenging but important thing to be able to do, to say like, yes, I poured everything I had into this, but you know what? I need to let it go now. And it's not going to be what I'm going to, and who knows, maybe you'll end up returning to it, or maybe a part of it will cycle into something else you write.
But it already has, in that way. And I remember being inspired once reading about how Beckett had had enormous volume, an enormous volume, a book that he thought was great that he wrote when he was young, and it stayed in a drawer, but he continued to tease out parts of it and work it into future books, and it became sort of a fertile ground, fertilizer for other books, compost for it. So
yeah. So once your first book, One of the Boys, was actually written, what did you learn or what surprised you about not the writing part, but everything else that goes into being an author in terms of getting it published and trying to get it marketed, and just what did you learn? Because obviously that's probably something that you had very little experience with, as a first time writer. And I'm sure there were a lot of surprises, things that you didn't expect along the way. What did you learn from that experience of actually getting the book out into the world after you've spent so much time working on it?
Somehow I was really focused on one thing in the writing of it, and in terms of knowing that eventually I was going to have to show it. I was going to have to find an agent. The agent was going to have to find a publisher. Um, there were so many people around me, young writers who, getting an agent is such a difficult thing in the writing world, and everyone was like, okay, I need to publish a short story in this kind of magazine so that I can get attention. I need to maybe get a professorial and adjunct job at this school so I can build connections, and everyone, it just seemed like, was working around the thing. How can I network in order to meet the agent? And my idea was just like, I'm not going to waste my time applying for fellowships. I'm not going to waste my time applying for residencies. I'm not going to waste my time applying for adjunct jobs and working on applications and writing those sorts of essays. I'm not going to spend time working on short stories. I don't know if they're going to get published. I don't really have an inclination to write short stories. I'm going to focus on the book. I'm going to make it as good as I possibly can, and I'm not going to come up for error, show it to anyone whose impression I really care about until I'm certain I've taken it as far as I possibly can. And that's what I did. And it worked out like a dream. I really can't, like, my entire literary career is not a dream. There have definitely been hiccups and detours, but for the first book, in terms of the publication, it was an absolute magical whirlwind. Books typically take about 18 months to go from the moment that they're sold to the moment they're published, and mine was sold from the moment from them selling it to publishing was 11 months.
Oh, wow.
It was done. It was done when I turned it in. People were excited about it, and they wanted to get it out in the world as quickly as possible. I had an agent within 3 weeks of sending the manuscript to a few agents I was hoping for, and I had a book deal 2 weeks after that because we just went. It was just go, go, go. It was ready, and then all of a sudden, it was being reviewed everywhere. It was being reviewed in the New York Times. It was being reviewed in Rolling Stone, the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, the New York Post, the Guardian, Le Monde. I mean, it was Maureen Corrigan was talking about it on NPR. It was just what just happened, and it was incredible. Um, and 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 the hilarious thing is, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I wanted it more. I wanted to be the finalist for big prizes. I wanted to be on all of the end of the year lists, and it was an incredibly nerve-wracking experience. And I don't think I really took a moment to really enjoy it. I remember the day it came out, I was in Los Angeles. I had just done my first book about the night before. I went to LAX with my wife, and in the airport was a copy of One of the Boys, and right next to it was People magazine, and I was featured in it.
Oh, wow. Now there's a deal.
And it wasn't enough. And then hilariously, when the second book came out, um, it had zero commercial success. It had very few reviews. And obviously, it wasn't enough. And so when I put those two things next to each other, and I was thinking about working on, and I was figuring out the third book, I was in the process of writing it, I told myself, like, if the publication, if no matter what happens in terms of the publication, I'm not going to be happy. It's either not going to be enough or it's really not going to be enough.
Mhm.
Then I better make sure that I'm doing this for the joy of the process,
Yep.
because there's nothing else. There's nothing else but actually sitting down with the words, discovering the meaning, finding your way through passages that feel uplifting, that feel moving, that make you feel like you're really connecting to the mind of another. Um, then there's no point in doing it. It's too hard. It takes too long. So I think that that was my big takeaway when it came to writing both books. And the other thing I'll say is I think one of the reasons the second book did not get the attention the first book got is that there's certain things that are out of your control. Like the moment in which we live is sometimes out of your control. My first book came out in 2017. Trump was just elected for the first time, and the topic of toxic masculinity was everywhere in our society. And that book is a prescription for toxic masculinity. And Walk the Darkness Down, um, it just didn't have that cultural moment to attach to. So
I think that makes sense. My next question was going to be about Walk the Darkness Down, which, I'll give you some free press for it because I read it and I thought it was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. I read it a few weeks ago. It's for people who don't know, it's about a married couple who have suffered a devastating family tragedy, and the husband and wife coping with it in different ways. And the husband, whose name is Les, he works on a fishing boat. And so was that a pretty good synopsis of the book so far without giving too much?
You nailed it.
Awesome. Fantastic. If you need some free publicity, Danny, I'm your guy.
You can write some copy.
I'd be happy to. So the husband, whose name is Les, he works on a fishing boat. My question was, from everything that you said, I might be wrong. Sounds like your first book drew a lot on your personal experience. Unless I'm mistaken, it doesn't sound like that second book was connected to your personal experience much at all. So my question is twofold. One, where did you kind of get the inspiration for that second story, which seems like it kind of just sprung from your imagination? And then secondly, if you didn't have, again, a lot of the book, about half the chapters really take place on this fishing boat, and it's this cast of characters, and they have this really lived in, authentic way of talking to each other. Just like they feel like they've known each other for years. And the lingo they use felt really authentic. I mean, I don't know a lot about fishing and scalloping, but it sounded very genuine and authentic to me. So my question is twofold. One, where did that idea come from? And then two, if it's something that you didn't have as much experience with, like with your first book, how did you go about gaining the knowledge that you needed to write a book that felt just as lived in and personal, even if it didn't come from your actual lived experiences?
That's a great question. Two great questions. I think certainly after publishing one book, you have the confidence to sort of move into spaces that you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable with. I would not have felt comfortable writing from a woman's perspective for my first book, and now I wrote half of the second book from a woman's perspective, and this second book, the third book, is almost entirely from a woman's perspective. So I think part of that is just coming into your own and feeling confident that you can explore things that you aren't necessarily connected to in many ways. And I'll say that I feel like there's almost too much pressure these days on people to sort of stay in their lanes and conform to what others say is their sort of identity place and sort of the broad scope of identity. Artists are artists, and they need to have the permission to explore the ideas and the styles and the perspectives that they feel that they need to in order to fulfill their work. And that doesn't mean that the world needs to accept it, but like we don't need to shut them down before they start to do so. And so I mean, where would we be without James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room is one of my favorite books, and that's a black man writing from the perspective of a white man. A gay black man writing from the perspective of a gay white man. And so I think for the second book, the idea started actually with the wife, whose name is Marlene, and not to give too much away, but and the way that she copes with this unimaginable tragedy is she drives the streets at night. She's alone because her husband works 300 days of the year out on a commercial fishing trawler, and she drives the streets at night and she picks up homeless women and brings them home and cares for them. And that's sort of what she does. It's kind of a beautiful space of like quiet. It's very sort of religious. It feels ritualistic, and it really highlights the grief and also the attempts at healing. And that was where the book started. And so Les's character kind of originated after that, where I thought to myself, okay, well, who is this person who's gone all the time? And I had been spending a lot of time in Cape May, New Jersey, where I now live, which is one of the largest fishing ports in the country. And I was spending time with some commercial fishermen who my wife had grown up with. And I asked them if I could go out on a trawler with them and for research for the second book because I had a suspicion that this would be perfect sort of occupation for Les. After several months of pleading, they took me out. We went out for 10 days. We did not see land for 10 days. We steamed 60 hours straight into the Atlantic and we trawled for scallops for the entire time. And I just lived on this boat with these men. Some of them were excited for me to be there, others did not want me to be there. And I just sort of listened and paid attention and just sort of tried to absorb the culture and the experience. But really is a meditation on first off, what is this job? And also who is this character? Fortunately, at that same time, I had been teaching at Columbia and in the undergraduate and in the graduate school for 5 years. And somehow I got sort of pigeonholed as the dialogue guy. And so I had been teaching a dialogue course, a voice course for years and just picking some of my favorites and reading and exploring. And I felt really well equipped at that point to create sort of this cacophony of like voices who are pushing and pulling, working together. There's tons of sort of like fluidity between them, but there's also conflict, there's subtext, there's pecking orders. But sort of the operating ethos for it, which was really fun for me, is when I was out on the boat listening to these guys talk, they seem to gossip like hens.
Yeah, that
And
comes through
and
the book.
yeah, and meanwhile, so the idea I had for Marlene at home was much more of this sort of quiet monastic sort of life.
Huh?
And so as sort of like a writing exercise, it was really this sort of like it was the upheaval of sort of like traditional gender norms in ways where it's like, okay, let's let the women be quiet and let's let the men gossip and just see what kind of energy comes out of that inversion. And so that's sort of where the dialogue was born.
That's I'm curious, did you ever end up hearing back from did any of the guys who you went out on the boat with, did you ever hear from them after the book was published? I'm curious if any of them were like, you know what? That sounds like us.
I think the joke is because several of them actually don't really like to read.
Yeah,
That the joke was is that I had to like show up and read it aloud to them.
gotcha. That's
So one of
yeah, with them.
yeah, so but one the fishing captain has become a good friend, and he read one of the boys and he read parts of Walk the Darkness Down. And I mean his comment essentially was is he wanted to know how he got sort of written out of the book because the captain in this one is the
Captain, all right.
Captain Allright though is that he's not as like Captain Brady who I went out with who he thought of himself more as a central figure in the book, and Captain Allright is a little more peripheral.
Yes, and for people who are wondering why he's named Captain All Right, it's a nickname because he starts every sentence that he says with "all right" and then moves on to it. It's a great book, and I hopefully some people listening to this will be inspired to check it out. I did have one last kind of inside baseball question about the style of the book itself, right? Like you described your writing style. You said that you kind of like cut things down and cut things down sometimes. I think that's really evident in one of the boys. And especially I was thinking about it when I was reading Walk the Darkness Down. I describe your writing as very sparse and to the point, right? And maybe the most kind of unusual choice you make in the book, writing stylistically wise, is there's no quotation marks. And you and a lot of the book is dialogue. Like, I mean, I would say maybe 30-40% of the book is dialogue between characters. I'm not surprised that you got pigeonholed as kind of the dialogue guy at where you teach, because the dialogue is what really drives the engine of the book. And that might seem like a small decision to omit the quotation marks, but as an English teacher, which is what I am, if I were teaching this book to a class, it's something that I would focus on and think about and talk about. I'm curious what your decision was behind making that choice and why you thought it was the right fit for the style you were going for. I realize that's kind of maybe a niche question, but it's something that I was curious about when I was reading. And I figured, you know what? I've got him here. I got to ask why he made that choice and what impact he was hoping to have. I have my own thoughts. I'm curious to hear from the author himself.
Well, I'm afraid that the answer is not going to satisfy because I wanted to do that for one of the boys too, and I got a lot of pushback from my publishers being like, "I don't know, you people might get confused. This isn't really something that a lot of writers do." I mean, my thought is essentially like it's really just an aesthetic one.
Mhm.
It just if I think if you sort of blur your eyes a little bit and look at the page, quotation marks, commas, they look like chicken scratches,
Mhm.
and I just like the look of a cleaner page. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, some of my favorite writers also write without it. I think
Well,
Cormac
McCarthy was going
McCarthy
to be my
does.
guest there right away.
Yeah, except for he at least does like an M dash that's
Mhm.
almost like it's almost like a playwright would do, which I really like that style too. Some writers in the UK, when they only have in the UK editions, there's only one quote on each side of a dialogue, which I actually really like that style too. I tried to convince my publisher for one of the boys to do that, and I folded. I could have insisted, and I didn't. And so when with the second book, I was just like, I'm going to do I like the cleaner page.
Yeah.
And so for the third book, I'm also doing that. And I think, Sally Rooney, who's one of the most popular literary writers in the world, I mean, she doesn't do it, and she's on the bestseller list every time she publishes a book. So I think there's been a little bit more tolerance for that style. Uh,
Well, to me, it fit really well because, the characters are, there's so much tension between them, and it's almost like each line of dialogue is almost like a little blade. Like they're sharpening knives against each other. And like you said, it's an aesthetic choice when you look at the page, but it gives it a real feel of immediacy and makes it feel like it's moving like really sharply. And sometimes the grief behind the tragedy that drives the story, it's almost like a runaway train, like a snowball rolling down a hill and it can't stop. So to me, it fit perfectly. Like it once
that's nice.
I adjusted to it,
Just
it really seemed like the right choice to for the narrative I was reading. So I was
one
just
of
effective on it.
I want. I mean, I as I was writing that second book, I did really become more and more comfortable with that style. And as I did that, I recognized something else was happening because I do think that's a really wonderful read. But I think there's just in life and in like on the page, there's such a thin veil between the things you think and the things you say.
Yes, that I was going
And
to say
I
that
love
exactly.
and a lot of the dialogue and a lot of sort of the narrative arcs that I'm looking for is people figuring out ways to understand themselves, understand someone else, and connect with them on a real emotional level, on sort of a healing journey in some capacity where they go. The books, both books are pretty dark, but by the end, there's light, I think, on the horizon. And I like the idea of sort of playing with the tension of a character, uh, of sometimes being uncertain whether the character is thinking it or saying it. And I do think there's a lot of clarity. I don't think you're ever confused on whether it's a thought or a spoken thing. But I just liked when you take the quotation marks away, sort of that veil, that the scrim sort of dissolves. And I think the characters are more sort of emotionally vulnerable without the dialogue.
I think that's beautifully said. All right, I've got two last literary related questions for you before we can pivot to some HBHA talk for the end. So you said that you've written every day for 17 years, which is pretty incredible. So my question connected to that is there a particular routine that you do that works for you to help you do that? And also, why is it important for you to write every day, and how do you motivate yourself to do so when I'm sure there are days where you wake up and you can't wait to get back to it? And I'm sure there are days where you wake up and you're like, I'm on vacation, or I'm not, I just don't feel like it today. So what does your writing routine, if you have one, look like? And also, how do you motivate yourself to keep going day after day after day, even though you might not see the yield of what you're working for 5, 10 years down the line, knowing that sometimes.
Yeah. I think when I first started, the routine was everything. Waking up at the same time, going to the same places, having the same ritual. it needed to be the same breakfast, same coffees, and you just sort of and you occupy that part of your day every day. It's like how you build in gym time or whatever, your workout routine. As I've gotten older, I've had children,
Yep. Yeah. That
and especially when they're 2 and 6 years old and you work from home, it you I have had to learn to become a little bit more flexible. I'm not always I can't get to the desk at 7 in the morning anymore. I just can't. And you know what? If I wake up at 5 to get some writing done first, invariably one of the children will wake up at 5:15.
of course.
It's just like they just know. So I become a little bit more flexible, and I just make sure that there's a 1 to 3 hour slot, sometimes a lot more than that, but 1 to 3 hour slot every single day that's sort of built into the schedule, and it can be a different time. For example, I haven't done it yet today. So as soon as we're done,
Talking to
I
me.
have, I have, the next 3 hours blocked off because both kids are home from school today, and yeah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I really needed the routine early on in order to make sure that it got done. Now it's second nature, and I'm just like in a better mood when I do it. It is like going to the gym in some ways. I don't necessarily like doing it all every day, but I like having done it every day. And some days it feels like you're getting tons done, you're really connected to the work, and other days it feels like, I think Oscar Wilde said, I spent my morning putting the comma in and my afternoon taking the comma out. And
It's a
it
good.
does feel that way. Yeah, it does. It does. That was a normal day of writing for it. And so I think just the idea is that no matter what it is that you want to accomplish, no matter what dream you have, no matter how you're sort of building your life, what you're building your life around, you have to devote some time every single day to accomplishing it. And it could be as much as 30 minutes. It could be as much as 8 hours, but every day you have to stay connected to it. And I think, especially with artistic enterprises, what happens is, and this is what I tell my students, over enough time, you sort of develop this sort of sweet spot where you're doing the dishes, or you're walking the dog, or you're in the garden, driving your car, and your mind naturally wanders back to the work. That's where, in the quiet moments, you are still occupied by it. And if you don't spend the time doing the work, then you can't have that sort of continuous meditative space, because your mind will be 1,000 miles a minute going all over the place. And so it really is this sustained meditation over the course of several years, and you just have to stay religious to the practice.
I think that's extremely well said. And I think it's great advice for anyone, whether they want to be a writer or really go into any sort of creative field, whether that's for a professional thing or just as a hobby, that, it's a combination of, you have to work extremely hard and be disciplined and have the focus. And at the same time, you have to consciously take those breaks and let your mind wander in order for those connections to be made. And the combination of those two is difficult. And like you said, it might take years and years and years. And sometimes you might go down a path that you end up abandoning, but all of it is kind of necessary to getting where you want to go. Honestly, Danny, I could talk to you about the book stuff for another hour or two, because I love your writing and I love hearing about the process you go through to write. But the podcast is also called HBHA Lore, so I do want to make sure that we have time to cover a few HBHA themed topics. So let's start with this. You graduated in 2002. Were you at HBHA from kindergarten, or did you join later on down the line?
Started in kindergarten. I even did preschool at JCC. And for 2 years, eighth grade and freshman year, we lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is a lot of the source material for one of the boys.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then we returned back to the HBHA for the rest of our time.
All right. Now, you kind of alluded at the beginning when we were chatting to some teachers who might have been influential, but I'm curious if you want to expand a bit on, you said that, when you were a student here, that you always loved to write, but no one would have maybe pegged you as a future professional writer, but are there any experiences
Mhm.
you had? It could either be a specific teacher, a specific class, or maybe even just a one-day thing that happened that you look
Yeah,
on and you're like, you know what, that really had an influence on me ending up where I am today.
yeah. I'll never forget Miss Kagan diagramming the conflicts, man versus man, man versus nature, man versus machine. It's always been such an interesting way to think about it from sort of a telescopic lens. I really liked Mr. Kaufman. He had
Dates
this,
me. Mrs. Kagan I had. She was my sixth grade
yeah,
teacher. And
yeah.
so
So
I learned a ton from Mrs. Kagan. Mr. Coffin, I'm not familiar with.
Mr. Kaufman was an English teacher. He was probably there for 3 or 4 years. He had this extraordinary voice. Like it felt like he belonged on stage. And so, we had to memorize the Canterbury Tales, which I can still remember a lot of the passage we had to remember. And but just to hear him sort of orate, it was always I loved hearing the sounds of him. And you know, I'll say this just because I think it's important to say, but I remember Mr. Clower was there, showed up, I think, when I was a junior and a senior. And
Okay.
yeah, and I remember he was my stats teacher, and he was also, I was the student body president, and he was there, and he was the teacher who was in all the meetings. And when I came back for Walk the Darkness Down, he greeted me with such warmth, and I sat in his office for an hour in 2023, and just really connected to him, I mean, I was in his class when 9/11 happened, so I don't know, God, it was a month ago, I wrote him because I knew that he was going through it in 2023 when I visited, and a month ago, or I wrote him an email just to check in on him because I hadn't spoken to him in 2 years, and it was a week before he passed. He didn't respond, of course, but it's just tragic to hear, and I don't know. He was a meaningful presence. Even though he was a stats teacher, he was a meaningful presence.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, you would have been there right when he was starting, right? And he was here for 25 years and stats teacher, like you said, helped with Stuco, and then in that quarter century since did basically every single role possible in the school. But that's amazing that I mean, it's incredible hearing, the students here now have been so influenced and impacted by him and you who've gone on to have a whole other career, have a family of your own now. You can just see the longevity of his impact, right? On going a whole generation plus of HBHA students. You also mentioned that, we've spent a lot of time talking about writing, but your other love, especially when you were in high school, you said was playing basketball. Any particular memories that jump out at you or things that you recall about your sports times at HBHA?
Yeah, we were. I don't know. Speaking of HBH lore, I'm going to throw the question back to you a little
Hey,
bit.
Danny, I'm ready.
So
I'm here.
I, I'm wondering. I'm wondering, does anyone talk about that era of basketball at the HBHA? Does
I do.
anyone remember it? Does anyone, is basket like, because my recollection of it is that we were force in the city. Like we were so good and it was incredible. There were like 80 kids in the high school, 40 boys, but somehow we had a collection of basketball talent where we were beating 4A, 5A schools. We played Blue Valley North on their court in a real game. Like we were Bishop Miege. Um,
Yeah.
it was an epic time where the gym was crowded every game, and we were getting written up in the Kansas City Star. It was like, what is happening?
Danny, I assure you that I'm keeping the memories and the lore alive and well. Obviously, the students are a bit young to recall, but so when you graduated, if you graduated in '02, and you were in my sister's class, I have an older sister, Rachel. I was in sixth grade when you graduated. So as I was coming up through middle school and in high school, yeah, there were, as you said, some fantastic basketball teams. 2 years after you graduated, the boys team won Sarachek. Did you ever go to
Yeah.
Sarachek? Did you ever play in any of the
I would, yeah. We went to Sarachek. We
national
went to Sarachek. I won the 3-point shooting competition at Sarachek.
Oh, you should have led
Uh,
with that. We spent an hour talking about your
yeah,
books, Danny. We should have been
yeah,
talking
no,
about your point prowess.
yeah, yeah. And the year that we went there, it was a real shame. We had an extraordinary team, my junior year, and I think we lost in the semifinals.
I assume your third book is going to be about an elite 3-point sniper just
It's
draining
not.
shots from increasingly long distances.
It is not.
Um, no, you are correct. Those were some really incredible teams. And hopefully when people listen to this, which will come out this episode maybe shortly after the basketball season begins, it'll really inspire both the boys and the girls basketball team to a dominant performance this season. Because are there any games in particular that you played in? Maybe it was a personal performance of yours where you dropped like 38 points one day, or just an incredible comeback.
I
To recall.
It was really, I think it's just playing with my brother. He was a junior, he was a senior, and I was a junior, and just being on the court with him, running and it was a fun time to be on that court. And there was a time I remember we traveled away. It was like 45 minutes into Kansas. It was on the Kansas side. And when we were playing this 4A Kansas school, I can't remember the name. And I remember I hit a half court shot right at the buzzer of the first half. And we ended up in overtime that game. And it was just this really incredible battle back and forth. And I remember my brother scored 10 points in overtime. He scored all of the points that we had in overtime, and we ended up winning the game. And it was really fun. And I also remember that year, I think we played Bishop Miege. And I don't know if you remember Mr. Allen,
I
who
do.
was okay. So Mr. Allen he'd come to the HBHA. He was the AP US history teacher, gov teacher, and he had come from Bishop Miege. And so it was a big deal for him that we go in there and beat that team. A week prior, my brother got a D on his art assignment, I think, with Mrs. Phillips.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And he was ineligible to play that game.
Oh no.
Yeah, and we lost.
Oh my God. He couldn't have turned in the art assignment. Come on.
No,
Here.
yeah. He failed an art assignment or something like that, and all of a
Call it
sudden he
out.
was ineligible, and it was just like, what happened? You know? So
Wow.
it's something still hasn't lived down. Have you? Yeah.
That's tough, but you know what? Now it'll live in infamy, that story on this podcast. All right, to wrap things up, Danny, I always like to ask some rapid fire questions for guests. So a couple more minutes, and then I'll get you out of here. First one is as a writer, I actually have some guesses about this. Maybe I'll take a guess at it first. I'm curious if there are any authors who you look to, either current authors or authors from the past, who have been particularly influential or inspirational to you as a writer. I have a couple of thoughts that I might guess.
You first. You first.
The person that we mentioned, which is Cormac McCarthy, because your style
Right.
reminds me a lot of him. I figured you might be a fan of his.
The third book, especially, is going to feel very like him.
And then I also thought a bit about Ernest Hemingway, and who likes his boats and also kind of that sparse, direct style. But I don't need to speak for you. Are there any authors who have kind of been guiding lights for you?
I think Dennis Johnson is an extraordinary influence, especially his book, Jesus' Son. That book was an attempt to sort of remake an Isaac Babel book called The Red Cavalry Stories. Isaac Babel stands like and on the altar of literary gods for me. So Isaac Babel, um, a Ukrainian Jew, and um, Marilyn Robinson is an author that I just adore. Her style is a little different from mine, but the way that she composes sentences just it's magical. And there's a contemporary writer who's a good friend of mine who I adore also. Her name is Hannah Lilith Asadi. And she has a new book coming out in January. Called Paradiso 17. And then in the end, George Saunders will forever be an influence. If nothing else, I feel like if I'm struggling in to be a good writer or struggling to be a good person or sort of looking for some guidance on the page, on the literary page, I feel like any time I open up his stories, I find something that's sort of soul expanding and also I think gleeful. So
Okay. Well,
okay.
your days are very busy and intensive with writing. What do you like to do to relax and unwind when you're not? If you've been a good hard day, 3-4 hours, plucking away at the keyboard, what do you do to relax and unwind afterwards?
Play with my kids, throw some pitches to my son who's a big Bobby Witt fan,
Oh, of
and
course.
and just work in the garden.
Oh, what do you like to grow? You growing
Got anything. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We live in the Garden State, so the tomatoes in New Jersey are pretty spectacular.
any particular you've lived on the East Coast now for a while, New York and New Jersey. Any particular places that you would recommend if someone is just visiting out on the East Coast, either the Jersey side or New York? Maybe a lesser known place that people don't always hear about that you're like, this is the spot if you're nearby that you should come and see.
So the Hungarian pastry shop.
Okay.
Go have some burnt coffee and terrible pastries, and just feel sort of the Marxist aesthetic. There are no
Oh, I
outlets.
was picturing this great latte and
No,
these
no, 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 no.
pastries.
There
The
are
food and the drink
no.
is terrible. That's what fuels the writing.
It's right. The coffee's bad. The pastries are worse. There are no outlets. There is no internet. There's no music. It's
That's why I
bad
would.
form to actually answer your phone in the space. The bathroom graffiti is exactly what you'd expect in a sort of in the shadow of a literary of a academic institution, and hilarious. And yeah, so that's what and then also where I live now, it's Cape May, New Jersey. It's the most southern tip of the state. It's where the ocean and the Delaware Bay meet, and it's just a really beautiful place.
Grab a little boat and do some scalloping.
Mhm.
All right. I think that's a great place for us to wrap up, Danny. This has been absolutely wonderful. Again, as I said, as an English teacher, it's been especially joyful for me to have an extended conversation with an author and really pick your brain and hear about your writing process and how you went about writing those two books. And I wish you the best of luck on your third book. Hopefully that'll come out soon. And I'll certainly have it on my to read list. Again, Danny's books are One of the Boys and Walk the Darkness Down. I can tell you personally that they are both fantastic books that I would highly recommend to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today on HBHA Lore, Danny.
Thanks, Micah.